Hello everyone, today I'm going to be doing a screen recording of the pulmonary function background and testing lecture that we had in class on Monday. This is just a very basic review lecture of what you've already learned in Prac 2. If you review those notes, those will be helpful. Before we get started, this is my first time ever recording a video like this using an iPad, an Apple Pencil, and a screen recording. So if anything doesn't work on your end, please let me know and I'll do everything I can to correct it and fix it. And also, I'm sorry in advance about my handwriting. It's already pretty terrible to begin with, but I am recovering from a boxing injury that injured my right hand, and I am right-handed. So I will be doing my best. Hopefully it's legible. The lesson objectives for today's lecture are to distinguish between restrictive and obstructive pulmonary dysfunction, to define the terms for FEV1, FVC, FEV1 and FVC ratio, and the flow volume loop, particularly in diagnostics of pulmonary function or dysfunction, and patient counseling for using a PHRM meter. So let's go ahead and get started. The two major determinants of pulmonary function are the volume of air that you're moving in and out of your lungs and the rate at which this air is moving in and out of the lungs, or the flow rate. And even if we have multiple people that have perfectly healthy functioning lungs, these will be different for each person based on four main demographics. And those are first, height. Obviously, if a patient is much taller than another one, it makes sense that their lungs would also be larger. They'd have a greater volume moving in and out of their lungs. Age is another one. And typically, our lung function goes up until about age 25. Then it's downhill from there as far as pulmonary function goes. Gender is also another one. Males typically are able to move a greater volume at a greater rate in and out of their lungs. And last one is race. If we have two males that are the same age and the same height, but one is Caucasian and the other is African American, typically the African American would have longer legs and a shorter torso, and therefore they'd have slightly smaller lungs and would have a slightly smaller volume moving in and out of their lungs. So what we do is when a patient comes in, we will take these demographics from them, we will plug those into a computer, and it will give us predicted pulmonary function values. Now, since we're using a computer, even in a clinical sense, I'm not going to expect you to calculate these on your own. I will give you predicted pulmonary function values. If it's on a test situation, you'll use that to compare their actual pulmonary function values to determine whether or not there's any kind of dysfunction and what kind of dysfunction there is. Now, there are two major types of pulmonary dysfunction, the first of which is a reduction in volume, also known as restriction or restrictive lung dysfunction. Now, this can be intrinsic, and you can think of that as like taking place inside the lungs, limiting the volume from the inside. That would be fibrosis is an example. Pulmonary edema is another example. And then your volume can also be restricted from the outside or extrinsically. And obesity is one of the major ones of those. Obese patients typically have a harder time breathing. You'll see that quite a bit in practice. Pregnancy can also cause a restriction of volume. It's not really considered a disease, but it is a condition in which the amount of volume will be lower compared to normal, particularly later in pregnancy. Scoliosis, there we go. Scoliosis, if the curvature of the spine is severe enough, it could inhibit the lungs from expanding all the way, therefore restricting volume. And the other major type of pulmonary dysfunction is a decreased flow rate or obstructive pulmonary dysfunction. And this can be intrathoracic And then the main ones we're going to focus on here are asthma and COPD. The O in COPD actually stands for obstruction, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These, again, are the main two we'll focus on in class, but even a stuffy nose can cause obstruction. Patients who snore, they have some kind of obstruction. Again, there's typically some kind of noise associated with the breathing in an obstructive lung disease. Asthma, we're going to hear a wheeze. You could hear a stridor, which is kind of a grating noise when it comes to breathing. I've heard a wheeze before, and it definitely sounds much different through a stethoscope. I will post some YouTube videos maybe where you can hear the different lung sounds for obstruction, but to me it sounds kind of like a dinosaur the first time I heard it, like a dinosaur was inside someone's chest. It's very, very interesting to hear it through a stethoscope as opposed to, I've lived with asthma, and it sounds much different as the person actually experienced the wheeze. And there's also extrathoracic, takes place outside the lungs. That could be from a swollen thyroid or goiter. It could be from vocal cord problems. Even GERD can cause some inflammation around the windpipes. So occasionally patients with GERD will have decreased flow rate, but it's not one of the main ones you hear of. Again, asthma, COPD will be the ones that we focus on here. So how do we use these predicted lung values that we talked about here in order to determine if we think a restriction or an obstruction is taking place? Well, the first thing we'll do is we'll have a patient describe their symptoms. So that's one. But once we think there might be something going on, or if we just want to test pulmonary function, we'll use what's called spirometry. The patient will have their nose plugged, as you see here. They'll breathe. They'll take a deep breath in. They'll wrap their lips around this device. They'll breathe out. Oops. Oopsies. Did not mean to click on that. They'll breathe out as hard and fast as they can. And then while their mouth is still wrapped around the device, they'll breathe back in. They'll repeat this a few times, and we will be given a chart. Now, I have printouts of the chart posted on the slide sets in the under the pulmonary function module on Canvas, but so you can have an easier time interpreting those charts. It will have a y-axis and an x-axis like this. The y-axis is your flow rate, and that is in liters per second. Your x-axis is going to be your volume, and that's going to be in liters. This side of the graph will be exhalation, so when they're breathing out, we'll see it on this side, and on the bottom half of the graph is inhalation. And as they move down the x-axis, this is actually the liters of air moving out of the lungs as you go down the x-axis. So on this side is going to be, whoops, totally wrote backwards of what I was saying. This side is going to be empty lungs, and this side will be full lungs. So again, the patient will take a deep breath in, they'll wrap their lips around the device, and as they breathe out, it will look a little something like this. It comes to a peak, and then it goes down. And now we have empty lungs, and as they breathe back in, it's a little more smooth on the inhalation. Well, I said that, and then I drew it, not very smooth. It's a little more smooth on the inhalation, kind of a half oval, half circle looking ordeal. So the reason it comes to a peak right here, and it has a sharp incline, is because this side is our large airways emptying, and this side is our small airways. The large airways are more force dependent, so if they're breathing out as hard and fast as possible, the majority of the air that's leaving the large airways will come out quickly. And then as the small airways are emptying, the rate will slow down. So this is what a healthy, functioning lungs flow volume loop will look like. This is called the flow volume loop. It's the name of this chart. So how do we tell if there's dysfunction here? Well, from here to here, this again is the volume. This is the volume of air you're moving in and out of your lungs. Or in a clinical sense, we'll call it FVC, or forced vital capacity. Now, again, we'll have that predicted forced vital capacity, and what we're trying to see is if there is a significant reduction in forced vital capacity. And so we'll take the patient's actual FVC, and then we'll take the predicted FVC that was given to us using those 4 demographics: age, height, gender, and race. And what we're shooting for, we hope to have at least 80% of the predicted. If we have less than 0.8 or less than 80% predicted, that is indicative of restrictive disease. Again, restrictive is decreased volume. So what it'll actually look like, let's say the light blue line is healthy lungs, and then this green line is someone with restriction. They'll come in. It'll be much more squatty. It'll come down to here. And as you can see, they've got a much lower FVC. So this is what restriction will look like. Now let's see what happens with obstruction. So we have this flow volume loop here. Notice that time, this is liters per second and this is liters. Time is not plotted anywhere on here. So what the computer will do is actually mark the 1 second mark. And if you come down to here, from here to that 1 second mark is going to be our FEV1, or forced expiratory volume at 1 second. So we're trying to see how much of the air is coming out in the first second compared to the amount of air that's moving in and out of the lungs total. So with this one, we'll take the patient's actual FEV1 and divide it by their actual FVC. We're hoping for at least 70% this time. But if it's less than 0.07 or 70%, that is indicative of some kind of obstructive disease present. Now again, this is what a healthy functioning lungs flow volume loop will look like. Cancel, definitely don't want to stop that. Okay. If they're actually experiencing some kind of obstruction, COPD and asthma again take place in the exhalation. So it's going to look a little something like this. It'll have a little dip where normally it would have been smooth when it comes to the small airways. Now, asthma can get bad enough that the peak here wouldn't rise as high. And this would be like during an attack. And you'd see even something like this. I don't know where that line just went. Oh, okay. Whatever. So yeah, the peak wouldn't be as high. This is known as our peak flow. And we'll talk about that more in a second when it comes to the peak flow monitoring. But this is what asthma or COPD would look like. Again, the dip right here. And then if we have a fixed obstruction, it'll be much lower on the inhale and much shallower on, or much lower on the exhale and much shallower on the inhale as well. And this is what fixed would look like. And that would be something like tracheal stenosis or malignancy that's affecting both the inhalation and the exhalation, but this is fixed obstruction. What we're going to focus most on is this type of obstruction, the asthma and COPD. All right. right? So now we're going to move on to peak flow meter. And this is the PHR that we were discussing earlier. The meter is going to look a little something like this. It's got a mouthpiece down here that you're going to blow into, or the patient will blow into it. And then it will have a little gauge right here with numbers. Most of them go up to 800. They start at 0. And then there'll be a little tab here, and that when they breathe into it, it will move up, and then it'll stay whenever, you know, the patient stops breathing into it. The little red tab will stay at their peak flow. So again, what we talked about, this number right here is the peak flow. However, with these flow volume loops, it's in liters per second. With a peak flow meter, it's going to be in liters per minute. That's why the numbers are in the hundreds instead. So there is no number that we're shooting for across the board. Again, everyone has different lung function. We'll have patients all different ages doing this, different genders, different races, different heights, etc. So there's no specific number that we're shooting for. We're going to shoot for a patient's personal best. And the way that we determine a personal best peak flow is whenever the patient is healthy. They'll do this every day. And again, this is for asthma patients mostly that have, you know, varying pulmonary function. They'll have, when they're not experiencing asthma symptoms, they'll blow into this multiple times over the course of 2 weeks. They'll record their highest number. And from there, you're going to make an asthma action plan. And an asthma action plan tells you what kind of medications you're going to be taking at what time. We'll talk about the specifics of the medications once we get to asthma, but as far as patient counseling a patient how to use their peak flow meter, they'll first determine their personal best. And let's say this patient's personal best is 600. 600 is their personal best. We'll then have a green zone, a yellow zone, and a red zone based on percentages of this personal best. The green zone is going to be 80% to 100% of their personal best. So for this example patient, it will be 480 to 600. The yellow zone will be 50 to 80% of personal best, or 300 to 480. And red is going to be less than 50%, so anything less than 300 is considered the red zone. Now in clinical practice, this is where we're going to start using rescue in the yellow zone, and this is when we're going to seek immediate medical care in the red zone. We'll talk about that more in a bit. But we'll have their zones identified. A lot of peak meters will have a way to mark these zones. So for this patient, they'll be marked at 480 and 300. From 480 to 600, we'll mark our green zone. From 300 to 480 are yellow, and less than 300 are red. This way, when a patient breathes into the monitor, they'll be able to see, based on their number reading, what zone they're in. This is great for children or patients that don't want to do math. It takes a lot of the complexity out of it, makes it very simple for them. So my recording got cut out, but I have a YouTube video that I will link on Facebook. And I will bring an actual personal best monitor to class on Friday so you can see it in person. That wasn't supposed to say percent. These are in liters per minute again. So yeah, that wasn't supposed to be percent. That's supposed to be liters per minute. But I will bring one of those to class. But what I will do now is discuss the asthma action plan. We will talk about how to fill in the medicine portion of the asthma action plan when we discuss asthma on Friday. But what we'll do again for this part, if the patient's personal best is 600, then this will be 480 to 600. This will be 300 to 480, and then this will be lower than 300. We'll fill this out for patient. They will, when they're not feeling well, they will do this. They will see what zone they're in. Then they will go to their asthma action plan that you've created for them, and they'll find out what to do. So let's say this patient was in the yellow zone. It's less than 480, so they're in yellow. And they'll go down here. They'll come to yellow, and you're going to take, however many puffs the rescue medicine that you tell them to do, and they'll keep using these control medicines, etc. So that is what the asthma action plan will look like. We'll discuss that more in class. But for those of you that don't like YouTube videos, the guidelines do have written out explanations. Here's how often to do it, page 82 of the actual document, or by the numbering on the document, page 59. How often to do it, again, we discussed in class, long-term, daily, for people with moderate to severe asthma, for patients with a recent history of a severe exacerbation, they've recently been hospitalized, or they can do it more often just during exacerbations if they're a little bit better controlled most of the time. And then if they're having exacerbation, they can see if it's yellow zone or red zone. That's and what they should do there. So, whoops, that's in the guidelines. Also on page 145 of the document, number 122, if you're using the documents numbering, is figure 311. It's in section 3, component 2. It's written out instructions for how to use a peak flow meter. Basically, it's important that the indicators at the bottom of the scale, we'll go over this in class Friday when I have the actual peak flow meter with me. And again, I'll have a YouTube video posted on Canvas under the asthma module that you can watch. And it tells you what to do for the green, yellow, and red zones, and what action to take there. The last part of the lecture that we discussed was respiratory smooth muscle. We just went back a little bit into some physiology, just as a refresher prior to going into talking about the different drug classes. So let's say we've got our respiratory smooth muscle here. We've got two major types of receptors. I know this is a very accurate drawing of a respiratory smooth muscle cell. That was sarcasm. This is, all right, let's try that again. This is a muscarinic receptor, and this is a beta-2 receptor. Now, muscarinic is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. That's your rest and digest side. And the muscarinic receptors contract smooth muscle. If we're having an obstructive lung disease, we do not want contraction. So one class of drugs will be the anti-muscarinics. And the other side, we have the sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight nervous system, and the beta-2, that's relaxation of respiratory smooth muscle. That is a good thing. We want this. So we're going to have beta-2 agonists. We're going to have both short and long term. We'll discuss all of that on Friday. This is just something that you can look over your old notes on. Getting down the differences between these two receptors can help you a lot in terms of remembering, the types of side effects that you'll experience from both of these, the considerations to take into effect with each drug class. So I'd review your notes on the different receptors of the respiratory muscle that you've had in classes before we discuss it on Friday. And other than that, if you have any questions, please let me know. Hopefully this all worked out, and I